So I was supposed to record this episode 3 days ago. I had the topic, I had done the research, and I had my notes ready. And just as I was about to record, I thought to myself, actually, let me just check my phone quickly. And then somehow an hour passed. I had watched 3 videos of people I do not know cooking food that I will not make on YouTube. And after a while, I packed up my notes and told myself that I will record the next day. And then the next day came, and I got as far as recording a few sentences. But I also thought to myself, my voice does not really sound right. Why don't I go on YouTube and check for microphone placement techniques? And that day also, I ended up not recording anything. And then day 3, I just sat down, pressed record, and started talking. And what you are listening to now is the result of that. But here's the part I actually want to talk about. It was not the 3 days of delay that bothered me the most. It was what happened in my head during those 3 days. Because I was not relaxing. I was not enjoying the time I spent doom scrolling. I was just constantly thinking about recording this episode. Constantly, in the background of my mind, it was like a browser tab that I could not close. And then I started feeling bad about constantly thinking about it without actually doing it. And then I started feeling bad about feeling bad. And I kept thinking to myself, why can't I just be the person who decides to do something and just does it? Do I not have discipline? What exactly is wrong with me? And the more I thought about what was wrong with me, the less I actually wanted to record the episode. If any of this sounds familiar to you, you are exactly in the right place. I am Angelo, and this is the Clarity Podcast, where we take the things everyone experiences and yet nobody fully understands and break them down until they make sense. Today, we are talking about procrastination, why you do it, what is exactly happening in your brain, and why feeling guilty makes it worse and not better. And finally, what actually works. Let us get into it. Now, let me start with the thing that changed how I understood all of this. Procrastination is not a time management problem. Now, that sounds simple, but it changes everything. Because if it's not about time, then all the solutions built around managing time better, things like schedules, alarms, to-do lists, are not actually solving the problem. They are simply treating the symptom. So there is a psychologist at the University of Sheffield, Dr. Fuchsia Sirois, who has spent 20 years specifically studying procrastination. And she defines procrastination as the voluntary delay of an intended task, despite knowing you will be worse off for doing so. Now the key words here are voluntary and worse off. You know that you will face the consequences, and yet you choose to procrastinate anyway. Why? This is because procrastination is fundamentally about emotion. Specifically, it is about escaping a negative emotion that the task is generating. Now, think of your brain as having 2 people who are constantly disagreeing with each other. The first guy is your prefrontal cortex, and this guy is your rational, future thinking, and adult self. This is the part that knows that a deadline is Friday, and it knows the consequences of missing that deadline. This guy has a plan and a to-do list and very strong opinions about productivity. Now, there is also a second guy who is known as your amygdala. And this guy is your emotional, threat-detecting, survival self. This part does not care about Friday deadline. It does not care about the consequences. It only cares about right now. And right now, that task feels uncomfortable. Maybe because it is overwhelming, or maybe because it is tied to a fear of failure, or just maybe because the task is really boring. And the amygdala has one response to any discomfort: escape, immediately. And now procrastination is what happens when the amygdala wins any argument. The the relief you feel when you close that book and open your phone instead. That tiny and brief reprieve, that is not weakness. That is your brain successfully completing its primary mission, which is to remove a source of discomfort as fast as possible. The brain is doing exactly what it was built to do, but it is just doing it at the completely wrong time. And here is the crucial implication of this. If procrastination is an emotional response, then the solution is not more discipline or better time management. The solution is changing the emotional experience of that task, which is a completely different kind of problem and a much more solvable one. Now, more research was done in a university in Germany. In this research, they scanned the brains of chronic procrastinators and compared them to non-procrastinators. The chronic procrastinators had a physically larger amygdala, which is a bigger and more reactive threat detector, and they had weaker connections between the amygdala and the part of the brain responsible for acting despite discomfort, bigger alarm, and a weaker override. This is the procrastinator's brain in one sentence, and which also means, by the way, that some people are genuinely more neurologically prone to procrastination than others. This is not an excuse, but it is just important information, because it means the solution is not try harder or work harder. The solution is to build smarter systems around a brain that is wired in a very specific way. Now, before we go any further, I need to take a moment to make you feel better about yourself, because some of the most accomplished people in recorded human history were absolutely terrible at starting things. I'll give you 2 examples. Leonardo da Vinci took 16 years to finish the Mona Lisa. 16 years. That's a lot. He started it, left it, came back, and left it again. In fact, his patrons were increasingly annoyed and they sent him angry letters. Now, here is a man who is arguably the most talented human being who has ever lived, and he could not bring himself to finish a painting. Another example is the writer Franz Kafka. Now, Franz asked his best friend to burn everything he had ever written after he died, because he considered all of his work unfinished and unworthy. Anyways, his friend did not burn it, and which is why we have the books, the Metamorphosis, and the Trial. Nearly everything we associate with Franz Kafka was work that Kafka himself thought was not good enough to exist. Now, from these 2 examples, there is a pattern that exists. Procrastination was not about not caring. It was about caring so much that starting felt like risking something real. This is a very different problem. Now, bringing this home and viewing it from the perspective of a Nigerian. In Nigeria, we say things like, I go do am, I go run am for you. Now, we say these things so casually that we don't even register that we are making a decision to delay action. And then there is the NEPA version of procrastination. The light goes out and your battery is low. And if you're being honest with yourself, somewhere deep down, there is a small, quiet, slightly guilty relief, because now you have a reason to actually procrastinate. The light took your productivity, you tell yourself. The light did not take your productivity, but we've all been there. So I began reading a book recently called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. And I find it a wonderful coincidence that I started reading this book right around the time I was considering this topic for a podcast episode. And if you have read the book, you will recognize this immediately. He calls it the feedback loop from hell. Now, the basic idea of this concept is this. You feel anxious about something, and then you feel anxious about the fact that you feel anxious. And then you feel bad about yourself for feeling anxious about feeling anxious. Each emotion generates a new emotion about itself. And suddenly, you are not dealing with the original problem anymore. You are buried under layers of meta suffering that are often much worse than the thing that started it all. Manson wrote about this in the context of anxiety generally. But when I read it, all I could think was, this is exactly what procrastination does. Now, here's the procrastination version of the feedback loop from hell. And see if this sounds familiar. So you have a task, and this task generates discomfort, anxiety, overwhelm, boredom, fear of failure. Your brain avoids it. This is the layer 1. Now you feel guilty for avoiding that task. The task has not changed, but it carries more weight. This is the second layer. And then you feel bad about feeling guilty and still not doing anything. You start questioning yourself. You start questioning your discipline, whether you are actually capable. This is the third layer. And then, this is where it really goes wrong. The task is no longer just a task. It is now a test of your character. The stakes feel enormous. Starting feels like it requires climbing out of a psychological hole before you can even look at it. And this is the fourth layer. And eventually, more time passes. The deadline for this task gets closer. The panic adds another layer. And this is the fifth layer. You are now procrastinating on the original task and simultaneously managing a small emotional crisis about what your procrastination says about you as a person. None of this was on the to-do list, but now all of it is an obstacle. This is exactly what I described in the intro. For 3 days, I was not just avoiding recording an episode, I was running a full internal trial about my own character. The task was never the real problem. The problem was everything I had built on top of the task while I was busy not doing it. Now I found a research that confirms what the loop describes. So a Dr. Michael Wall at Carleton University studied students who had procrastinated badly before their first exam, and he split them into 2 groups. One of the groups was encouraged to reflect critically on what they had done and to hold themselves accountable. The other group was encouraged to forgive themselves and move on. And then he watched what happened with the second exam. Now, the students who forgave themselves procrastinated significantly less the second time, and the students who beat themselves up procrastinated more. Why? Because guilt is a negative emotion, and we have already established what your brain does with negative emotions. It avoids them. So when you pile guilt and shame on top of a task that's already emotionally uncomfortable, you make the task feel even worse. You add more fuel to the avoidance instinct, and the loop tightens. Beating yourself up for procrastinating is not accountability. It is basically procrastination fuel. The loop only breaks when you stop treating the emotional reaction as a second problem to be solved. You feel anxious about a task. Okay, fine, this is real. But you do not need to feel bad about feeling anxious. That second layer is optional, and removing it is exactly what Wall's research produced in practice. So, what do I advise? Stop punishing yourself for the delay. Not because it does not matter, but because the punishment you are giving yourself is actually extending that delay. Alright, so being more disciplined does not fix it. Guilt makes it worse, and the loop is the real enemy. So then, what actually works for procrastination? First of all, since procrastination is an emotional response to a task that feels threatening, the primary fix is lowering the emotional threat level of the task itself. The most research-supported technique for doing this is what psychologists call implementation intention. Now, this is just a fancy phrase for be very specific about when, where, and how you will start. You don't say things like, I will work on the assignments this week. Instead, you say, I will sit at my desk at 9 a.m. on Tuesday and I will do the assignment. This is an implementation intention and not a wish. Research shows this single change increases follow-through by up to 3 times. This specificity removes any ambiguity, and ambiguity is where the amygdala finds room to negotiate. Now, secondly, most procrastination is triggered by tasks that are too large and too vague. Saying things like, I will work on my business plan. This is a very large and vague statement. Your brain looks at it and feels overwhelmed before any single word is written. But when you say, I will write just the executive summary, 1 paragraph, before lunch on Wednesday, this is small and specific, and it is very hard to feel existentially threatened by writing just 1 paragraph. Now, this technique is called task decomposition, and it works because it lowers the emotional stakes of each individual step to the point where the amygdala stops firing. You are not trying to climb a mountain, you are stepping onto the first stone. And this makes the experience a completely different one emotionally. And this is exactly how I felt on the 3rd day. I did not try to record a great episode. I just decided to press record and say the first sentence. That was the only commitment I needed to make. 1 sentence. And once I got talking, I just kept going. The resistance is almost always highest at the start. Once you are in motion, continuing is significantly easier than starting was. And finally, I genuinely find this one quite interesting. Researchers identify a type called the structured procrastinator. This is someone who avoids their most important tasks by doing every other task on their list with tremendous energy and discipline. Their house is clean and spotless. Their unread messages is at 0. Everything is done except the one thing that matters the most. Now, a psychologist named John Perry suggests that structured procrastinators can actually use this tendency strategically. Now, when writing their list, they should put the big, scary, and important tasks at the very top of their list, and then everything else on the list becomes avoidance activity. Yet, those other things, when being done, achieve real progress. You are still moving, and eventually, with nothing left to hide behind, you do the important tasks. Is this an ideal system? No. It is a functional system for a brain wired towards avoidance. And so, finally, you should know procrastination is not laziness. It is not poor character. It is your brain choosing emotional comfort right now over consequences later. And then, if you're not careful, building an entire feedback loop of guilt and self-doubt on top of that original avoidance until the tasks feel 10 times heavier than it actually is. The task was never the problem. The loop was. And breaking out of this loop does not require extraordinary willpower. It requires 3 things. You have to forgive yourself for the delay, genuinely and not performatively, because the guilt is making it worse. And then you also have to shrink the task until it is almost embarrassingly small. And also, you do just that one small thing, not the whole thing. You climb just the first stone. For me, on day 3, the first stone was pressing record without adjusting anything first or feeling the need to check my phone. That was it. That was the whole plan. And it worked. And whatever you have been putting off, and I'm sure that exact thing just came to your mind the moment I said this. Do not try to do all of it today. Just do the first embarrassingly small piece of it right now before you put your phone down. Now, this has been the Clarity Podcast. I am Angelo, And if this episode has helped you in any way, please send it to one person who needs to hear it. See you next week, and until then, think clearly.